So, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, the current producers and writers of Game of Thrones, the most popular show on TV, are heading to a galaxy far, far away. So a lot of you guys sent me messages on social media yesterday after the big announcement that Dan and Dave from Game of Thrones would be heading over to the Star Wars franchise and apparently have been hired now to do a whole entire new set of Star Wars movies. And I was really actually surprised how many people sent me messages to get my thoughts on the situation, so let's talk about it. If you guys don't know, on this channel, you know that Star Wars was actually my first love. Obviously, it was the first movie I saw in a theater back in 1977. But I mean, I was real young back then. It wasn't like I was a teenager in 77, so I'm not that old. But the point being that Star Wars is my first love, and so a lot of you guys, I guess, are curious on what I think, since the writing has been, you know, kind of sketchy in Game of Thrones the last couple years, although it's still a very, very good show and by far the best on TV. And to be clear, David and Dan were announced by Disney, Lucasfilm, and Kathleen Kennedy in particular that they will be doing a new set of movies for Star Wars. Now, this will not be anything related to the main trilogy that we're in the middle of now, and this will not be related to the Rian Johnson trilogy that had already been announced. It is official. It is going to eventually happen. Maybe. And the reason I say maybe is because if you look into the past of Dan and Dave and their careers so far, I think it's safe to say that Game of Thrones is likely their biggest accomplishment. So let's mention really quickly a couple of their past works and how they did in comparison to Game of Thrones. So let's start with David Benioff. He has written a couple of books, one being called The 25th Hour and another called City of Thieves. Now, I have not personally read these books. He did write the screenplay for Troy back in 2004, and Troy was a pretty good movie if you think about the time period and all that good stuff. So I think Troy was one of his bigger successes before he actually stumbled onto Game of Thrones. He wrote the screenplay for Stay in 2005 and also wrote the screenplay for a movie called The Kite Runner, both of which I've never seen, so I can't personally say how good or bad they were. And then, of course, you come to some of the ugly. He wrote the screenplay for X-Men Origins Wolverine. Now, in his defense, I will say, to be fair, that somebody came in and rewrote a lot of his script because he saw it as a darker R-rated movie, and a guy named Skip Woods came in and changed a lot of that and basically rewrote his script for a more PG audience. So we're really not sure how much of Dave's original story stayed in X-Men Origins Wolverine, but overall that was not a great movie in my opinion. There were some good parts to it, but other things were pretty damn dumb, like the horrible, absolutely horrible Deadpool in that movie. But anyway, that whole thing has been erased now by the new timeline. So I don't want to get into the whole Marvel X-Men universe, whatever. But the point being that he did have a couple movies there. So that's basically the extent of his experience before stumbling onto Game of Thrones and making a deal with George R.R. Martin to get the biggest TV show ever on HBO. So let's take a look at D.B. Weiss. What has Dan done prior to Game of Thrones? Now, Dan also released his first book in 2003 called Lucky Wonder Boy. And I didn't read this book either, but I think it's centered around some kind of video game character, so I'm not really sure how that was. But then again, before I looked this stuff up, I had never heard of it, so I'm assuming it's not that big of a hit. He also worked on various projects as a personal assistant, but I guess that really doesn't have anything to do with writing the fucking movie, so you really can't count that as experience or non-experience. I guess he was just getting into the industry. And he actually did work on a prequel to I Am Legend. He wrote a screenplay for that, I believe, but it was never used. And the studio or whoever was head of that project basically considered that project dead, so I don't think that's going to happen. And if it ever does happen, it will likely be completely redone by somebody else. So let's look at a couple pros and cons of Dan and Dave as far as their experience on Game of Thrones and how that could translate into a galaxy far, far away. So first of all, with Game of Thrones, I think they did a pretty good job overall with the characters on the show. Now, I do know there is differences in the books, and I understand those differences from a book to a TV show, but I think overall Dan and Dave are pretty damn good at getting the depth of characters on screen as a visual medium as opposed to being authors. So I think they've done a fairly good job overall with Game of Thrones. There are a few characters that are different. Of course, there are a lot of characters that are missing, but that's completely understandable. So to be fair, I think they've done pretty good overall on Game of Thrones with the depth of these characters. Otherwise, there wouldn't be channels like mine talking about them, and there wouldn't be a big fandom of people talking about these characters, because this show did become a phenomenon for a reason and opened up the world of Ice and Fire to a lot more people, so you have to give credit where credit's due. Now, another possible pro to Dan and Dave heading over to Star Wars is they may not have any source material to stick by to have to try to follow somebody else's work. So they may or may not actually work better on their own as far as writing an original story. They just have to stick to the theme. Basically, like George R.R. Martin puts it, they have to now switch over to sci-fi, which is essentially a change of the furniture. So there's really no difference in sci-fi and fantasy other than the actual setting itself. So I think as far as the transition over to a Star Wars type sci-fi show, I don't think that'll be a big problem. Now, as far as Game of Thrones, I know they have, wandered a little bit from the books. They have changed a lot of things. But again, I can understand some of that as well because they don't have all the source material. Now, again, I am sure they have a lot more than we do. And they probably basically have the finished version of Winds of Winter, or what's going to be close to the finished version. And that's what they've been working off the last few seasons on Game of Thrones. So we'll see how they do when there's not really any source material. And the problem with that is, of course, is all the source material for Star Wars has now been put on a fucking shelf somewhere and called Legends. So the point is, will they have to go by any Legend stuff? Will they pull from that? Will they have the freedom to do that since they don't necessarily have to stick to hardcore source material, and they have a little bit more freedom to do what they want as far as whatever stories they come up with in the Star Wars universe. Now, another possible pro is that if you watch The Last Jedi, you know it really can't be worse than that. Now, I know half the people in the world loved it, half the people hated it. It was just my opinion. I did an honest review on Star Wars The Last Jedi, and I absolutely hated to say that I didn't like that movie because I love Star Wars. I hate not liking a Star Wars movie. But it all depends on the writers, and it all depends on the political agenda of said studio. For example, I loved Rogue One. It was a great, dark Star Wars movie that told a great story. I liked Episode 7, The Force Awakens, but it was too close, it was too safe for me as far as J.J. Abrams, as far as being a repeat of Episode 4, A New Hope, but at least it did its job introducing new characters and the new plot line of what was going to happen in the upcoming movies. But the problem with the current trilogy is there's too many damn writers, there's too many cooks in the kitchen, and nobody's on the same page. And another big problem for me personally, and a lot of other people I believe, as far as the 50% that didn't like this movie, The Last Jedi, was that it had a lot of political ideologies in there that were put on the screen. And that's fine if that's what they want to do. If they want to turn off half the audience, they can do that. The point is that I go to a movie or I sit down to watch a show to escape reality and politics and all that kind of stuff. As long as they focus on the politics of the story itself, that's fine. But a lot of people saw The Last Jedi as more of a modern day real world political statement versus an actual movie with in-depth characters with an actual plot. So it all depends on the studio as well and the individual writers and how much freedom they get based off what the studio wants to do and what direction they're going. So a couple of the cons we could look at that could be potential cons of Dan and Dave writing a Star Wars movie. Well, the writing, because some of the writing in Game of Thrones has undoubtedly been questionable as far as some of the storylines, some of the plot holes, etc. But at the same time, I do understand, again, just to be fair, that it is a show versus a book. A book you can go on forever. There's no limit to what you can do other than your imagination because there is no CGI, there are no budgets, there are no studios, there are no people from a major company trying to rush things and change things and want things a certain length and a certain rating, etc. But that being said, some of the writing, especially in the later seasons, has been questionable, so it makes you question, can they write a story on their own, a really good story, because anybody can actually write a story, but can it be good when they don't have that source material to go off of? And that brings me to con number 2, which is actually the same as the pro I mentioned earlier. Can they write a great story with no source material? Because really the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones were really close to A Song of Ice and Fire. They pretty much stuck to the books, and I'm sure they have rough drafts or manuscripts of Winds of Winter material that wasn't yet complete. So I do think we saw more Winds of Winter material in Game of Thrones so far than people want to believe or want to admit to. But again, the question is, can they write a story on their own that holds water without that source material to at least go by, to add things to, or to subtract things from? So overall, what I think it really depends, again, on the freedom they have to write a story, what they personally want to do as far as write a good story with in-depth characters and tell a great story in the Star Wars universe, and not put in modern day political agendas. 50% of the people that watch The Last Jedi aren't just crazy and making things up. These are really hardcore fans that didn't feel that Rian Johnson did a good job with that world that they grew up in. And I think the same can be said with Game of Thrones. A lot of people love the first 4 seasons and they say that 5, 6, and 7 were horrible. Some people are kind of indifferent like me. They love the whole damn thing. There are parts you don't like about it, and you talk about it, at least I do, on videos on YouTube. A lot of people don't do that, obviously, but I am going to criticize the show when I feel something is stupid, just like I criticized Star Wars The Last Jedi in my last review. I can't just come on here and say everything's great because it's Star Wars, or everything's great because it's Game of Thrones. There are problems with both, but it is undeniable that Game of Thrones is the biggest show in history and it's the biggest show in history for a reason. So overall, I think they've done a pretty damn good job. So I'm really overall not worried about it. I think they have the potential to do a great job, and I think they have the same potential to really fuck it up, and it really all depends on where they pull the material from. Are they going to pull from some of the great backstories in the Old Republic universe? I really hope Disney goes in the direction of pulling from some of that old canon material, now called Legends, because those are some really, really good stories. And in my opinion, some of those old stories, some of those stories that give you the origin of the Jedi, the origin of the Sith for that matter, and all these backstories, the Old Republic days, those stories are a lot better than the modern stuff that we know of, like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader. Those are better stories, in my opinion, than some of the stuff that's more well known as far as the mainstream films. So anyway, guys, that's my thoughts on it. I really don't have an opinion either way. It could be good, it could be bad, but I don't think they're the worst writers in the world, but I also don't think they're the best writers in the world either. But then again, neither were J.J. Abrams and certainly not Rian Johnson. So anyway, guys, let me know what you think. As usual, thank you for all the support, especially to you guys on Patreon. And a huge shout out to my executive Patreon smokescreen producers, Griffin, Lala, Kissa, Powell, Marylin, Bentley, JoAnna, Doc Holliday, Goska, HoonJive, Anonymous, Low Horton, Erin Habig, John Carey, Anastasia, Jason Landers, DTizSmith, MJW, Carole Brown, D Brown, Mel Hoffman, Michael Colton, and Lisa Phillips. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the support. Also, be sure to subscribe to get everything, and be sure to click that notification bell so you're notified when I drop a new video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.